Here is a number that should stop you cold. 70%. 70% of all family wealth, everything your parents worked for, everything you are working for right now, is completely gone by the time it reaches the second generation. And by the third generation, 90%. Now, most people hear that statistic and they blame the stock market. They blame bad luck. They blame lazy kids. But the data tells a different story entirely. Because the families that beat that statistic, the ones whose names you still recognize 3, 4, 5 generations later, they didn't just build bigger bank accounts. They built something the market cannot touch, something a divorce cannot divide, something a recession cannot liquidate. They built a system of thought. And that is what we're doing today on Wealth Forge. Not a lecture on estate planning, not another conversation about index funds. What we are building today is the structural blueprint for how your family name survives the century, not just the decade. Because at Wealth Forge, we operate by a single creed. We don't follow the market. We design the moat. In a world of followers, we are the architects of our own freedom. And today, we are going to architect something most people never even think to build. Stay with me, because what I'm about to lay out will completely change how you define the word inheritance. The failure of the inherited checkbook. Let me paint you a picture. It is 2026. A 28-year-old man, let's call him Marcus, receives a $900,000 inheritance from his grandfather. His grandfather built a construction business over 40 years. Early mornings, hard negotiations, 1,000 decisions under pressure with no safety net. Marcus, through absolutely no fault of his own, receives the product of those 40 years. But he never received the process. He never sat across the table with his grandfather and learned how to assess risk. He never watched him walk away from a deal that looked good on paper but smelled wrong. He never learned the one question his grandfather asked before signing any contract. So, Marcus, a genuinely good person with a genuine desire to succeed, does what most people do. He invests, he tries, he makes decisions with money, but without the invisible architecture that was supposed to support those decisions. And within 6 years, the $900,000 is gone. Not because Marcus was irresponsible, but because he inherited the output without inheriting the operating system. This is the real crisis of generational wealth in 2026, and the research backs this up completely. According to the Williams Group Wealth Consultancy, that 70% failure rate I opened with isn't primarily caused by bad markets or mismanagement. It's caused by a breakdown in trust and communication within the family unit, and a failure to prepare heirs for the responsibilities they're about to receive. In other words, the checkbook arrived, the blueprint never did. And this is where most financial conversations end. With a diagnosis of the problem, a shrug, and a recommendation to talk to your estate attorney. But we don't stop at diagnosis here. We build the cure. The structural blueprint for wisdom. I want you to reframe something in your mind right now. Stop thinking of legacy as a transfer. Start thinking of it as an architectural project. Every great building has 3 things: a foundation, a framework, and a system for maintenance. Your family's intellectual legacy needs exactly the same thing. The foundation is your core value set, not the vague feel-good version, not be honest and work hard. I mean a codified written document that defines how your family makes decisions under pressure. How do you define risk? What is your standard for walking away from an opportunity when what does accountability look like in your household when someone fails? These are not soft questions. These are the load-bearing walls of your family's future. The framework is what I call the Living Syllabus. Here's the concept. Right now, inside your head, there is a curriculum that no university offers. It's the specific combination of failures, pivots, relationships, and insights that built whatever you have today. That curriculum exists only in your experience, and when you're gone, it disappears, unless you document it deliberately. The Living Syllabus is a structured, evolving document. Think of it as a private knowledge base, where you record not just what you did, but why you did it. The deals you turned down, the partnerships you ended, the year everything almost fell apart, and the single decision that stabilized it. This is not a memoir. It's an operating manual. And in 2026, with tools like private AI archives and structured knowledge systems, there is absolutely no reason this syllabus cannot be interactive, searchable, queryable, and capable of delivering your specific reasoning to your grandchildren in real time, even long after you're gone. We'll come back to that in a moment. The maintenance system is governance. And this is where most families have the greatest gap. Building the private governance model. The word governance makes people think of corporations and boardrooms, but I want you to think about it differently. Governance is simply the answer to one question: who decides and how? In most families, that question is never answered until there's a crisis, a death, a divorce, a business failure, a legal dispute, and by that point, the absence of structure becomes catastrophic. Families that successfully preserve wealth across generations have something that struggling families don't: a formal decision-making architecture. Here is a model worth considering. I call it the Family Council Framework, and it mirrors the structure of a well-run corporate board, but built entirely around family values and long-term vision. First, you establish a regular family assembly, not a holiday dinner where money gets discussed awkwardly, a scheduled, structured meeting, quarterly or biannually, where the family's financial, educational, and relational health is reviewed openly. Age-appropriate involvement matters here. A 16-year-old doesn't need full financial disclosure, but they do need to understand that they're being prepared for a role, not just waiting for a reward. Second, you implement merit-based access to resources. This is where most families resist, but where the data is absolutely clear. When the next generation receives resources in direct proportion to demonstrated competency and commitment, not simply by virtue of their birthday, something remarkable happens. They stop seeing themselves as recipients and start seeing themselves as participants. Individual entrepreneurship flourishes. Accountability becomes self-imposed, not externally enforced. This doesn't mean being harsh or withholding. It means being intentional. There's a profound difference between those two things. And third, you establish written succession criteria. Who leads the family enterprise next? What qualifications are required? What values must be demonstrated? These questions, answered in advance and in writing, eliminate the two greatest destroyers of family legacy: favoritism and ambiguity.
Now here's the shift that ties everything together. All of this internal structure is meaningless if it doesn't produce results in the external world, which brings us to education, but not the kind most people think of. Modern apprenticeship and curated exposure. Let me challenge an assumption that I know many of you are carrying. The assumption is this: the best thing you can do for your child's future is to get them into the best possible school. Now, I'm not anti-education, not even slightly, but I want to ask you to examine what elite schooling actually transfers and what it doesn't. A prestigious degree transfers credentials. It transfers a network of peers at a similar stage of life. It transfers the confidence that comes from institutional validation. What it almost never transfers is industry DNA, the specific, granular, often unspoken knowledge of how your particular field actually operates at the highest level, the relationships that took you 20 years to build, the instincts that were forged in real risk, not case studies. That transfer requires something different. It requires deliberate apprenticeship. And in 2026, we have tools to make this more powerful than at any point in human history. Consider this. What if you spent the next 3 years systematically documenting your thought process, not just your outcomes, but your reasoning in a private AI archive? Every major decision, voice noted and structured, every framework you use when evaluating an opportunity, every red flag you've learned to recognize. That archive becomes a living mentor that your children and grandchildren can interact with long after your experience has faded from memory. I am not speaking hypothetically. Families right now are building private knowledge repositories using tools that already exist. What was once the exclusive domain of family offices with $100 million in assets is increasingly accessible to anyone willing to be deliberate. The question is not whether the technology exists. The question is whether you value your intellectual capital enough to preserve it. Because here's the truth that most people aren't ready to hear. Your most valuable asset isn't in your brokerage account. It's in your pattern recognition. It's in your judgment under pressure. It's in your network and the trust you've built inside it. And right now, all of that is set to expire with you, unless you architect the transfer. Curated exposure matters as much as formal documentation. Bring your next generation into real environments. Let them observe real negotiations. Let them sit in on a vendor meeting, a board discussion, a difficult conversation with a partner. Let them see that the real world operates on judgment calls, not textbook answers. The most powerful education you can provide is context, and context is not taught, it is experienced. The self-sustaining ecosystem. Now, I want to bring all of this together because individually each piece is powerful, but the transformation happens when they become a single, integrated system. Think of what we've built today. You have a foundation, your codified values and decision-making principles, written and reviewed. You have a living syllabus, your personal intellectual capital, deliberately preserved and made accessible. You have a governance model, a family council structure that teaches professional responsibility, accountability, and merit-based thinking from an early age. You have an apprenticeship architecture, curated real-world exposure, industry DNA transfer, and digital knowledge preservation for future generations. When these 4 elements operate together, they stop being separate projects. They become a regenerative system, one that does not require your constant intervention to function, one that is not dependent on any single person's energy or lifespan, one that is by design self-correcting and self-perpetuating. This is how family legacies survive a century instead of a generation. This is what the Rockefellers built, not just a fortune, but a philosophy of operation that persists across generations. This is what the great merchant families of Asia and Europe understood long before modern finance existed. You don't preserve legacy with money, you preserve it with structure, culture, and deliberate education. Now, let's talk about the transition of leadership, because this is often where even well-built systems collapse. Most family enterprises fail at succession because the founder confuses birthright with readiness. They assume that proximity to the family guarantees fitness for leadership. A true succession plan does not ask who is next in line. It asks who has demonstrated the values, the judgment, and the commitment that this platform was built on. And if the honest answer is no one yet, then that's not a crisis. That's an instruction. It tells you exactly where your next investment of time and energy needs to go. The transition of leadership, done right, is not a handover. It is a passing of the blueprint. The new architect doesn't rebuild from scratch. They extend the design. They add their own walls to a foundation that was already proven strong. And that, right there, is the difference between a family that had wealth and a family that is wealth. Here is where I want to leave you today. You don't need a $10 million portfolio to start building this. You need a blank document and 2 honest hours. Start with 3 questions. Write them down tonight. 1. What are the 3 non-negotiable principles that have guided every major decision I've made in the last 10 years? 2. What is the single most important professional lesson I have learned that no school ever taught? 3. If I disappeared tomorrow, what framework would my children have, in writing, to make decisions that reflect who I actually am? Those 3 answers are the first 3 pages of your Living Syllabus. That is your blueprint beginning to take shape. Because here at Wealth Forge, we believe in one thing above everything else. The greatest act of generational love is not leaving your children comfortable, it is leaving them capable. Capable of assessing risk, capable of building relationships, capable of making hard decisions with clarity, integrity, and confidence, whether there's money in the account or not. That is the moat. That is the architecture. That is the legacy that no market crash, no inflation cycle, and no generation gap can erode. We don't follow the market. We design the moat. And today, you just drew the first line of your blueprint. If this gave you something real, share it with one person in your family, not to show them the video, but to start the conversation that this video was really about. I'll see you in the next build.